Hey, my name is Milan and welcome to the Pragmatic REST APIs course where you will learn how to build fast, reliable, and maintainable REST APIs. In my career, I've built dozens of APIs. Some of them were RESTful and some were not. Some of them served more than 1 million clients, and I've taken everything I've learned while building these APIs and turned them into the Pragmatic REST APIs course that you are now watching. So let's see what is going to be our agenda for this course. We'll start with a quick introduction lesson, which is what you're watching now, where I want to introduce you to my background, give you an overview of the course, what we are going to cover, what are the course objectives, and what you should expect to learn by the end of this course. Then we're going to jump straight into REST with an introduction of the topic. I'll explain what a REST API is, what are the REST constraints that a REST API has to comply with. I'll introduce you to the Richardson Maturity Model, and we'll also start building the foundation for the application that we will be building as part of this course. Then we'll continue with a practical chapter where I will show you how to build a REST API. We're going to cover the HTTP methods, status codes, how to build an API for managing resources, how to implement support for sorting and filtering, data shaping, pagination, and I will cover the many best practices that you should be aware of when building a REST API. Then we're going to continue with probably the most important chapter of this course, which is HateOS and change management. Here, I'll highlight the importance of hypermedia and why it's required to build a proper REST API, but also how you can use it to make your API evolvable and discoverable, and how we can use hypermedia to drive the behavior inside of our client applications. We're also going to touch on the topic of API versioning and why it's maybe not the best solution for the problem that we are trying to solve. In Chapter 4, we're going to talk about authentication and authorization. I'll show you how to integrate ASP.NET Core Identity for implementing this functionality. We're going to implement token-based authentication. We're going to cover authorization and much more. In Chapter 5, I'll introduce you to the client application that we're going to use to integrate with our REST API. It's fully hypermedia driven, so we won't just focus on the best practices of building a REST API. We're also going to cover how to properly integrate it into a client application. In Chapter 6, we're going to talk about some advanced REST API concerns. These are topics that you'll definitely need for running a REST API in production, but I couldn't fit them into Chapter 2 where we were building a REST API. However, they deserve a topic of their own. So in Chapter 6, we're going to talk about rate limiting, idempotency, cursor pagination, webhooks, and how to build asynchronous API, and a few more topics. In Chapter 7, we're going to cover how to properly test REST APIs, why unit testing isn't the best approach for testing REST APIs, and I'll show you two better alternatives, and I will also demonstrate how you can automate your tests inside of a CI/CD pipeline. We'll continue with a discussion about documenting REST APIs in Chapter 8. We're going to cover the Open API specification and how you can use it inside of a .NET application. We'll also talk about Swagger and what happened with it in the latest .NET versions, and I'll introduce you to an interesting option for presenting your REST API documentation that's called Scalar. In Chapter 9, we're going to cover deploying and monitoring our REST API, and I'll show you how to implement a fully automated deployment pipeline into Azure. We're going to deploy our client application, we're going to deploy our database and our REST API and connect everything together in a production deployment. Last but definitely not least, you will find some bonus content at the end of this course. My plan with this course, as with all of my courses, is to keep evolving them over the years and always keep them current, and you should expect to see a new bonus lesson or mini course every few months. I also want to introduce myself a little and talk about my background and why you should be listening to me. If you don't know me, my name is Milan. I'm a senior software engineer. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for developer technologies, and I have been building enterprise-grade applications for nearly a decade. I've also built and deployed APIs serving more than 1 million clients, so everything I'm going to talk about in this course comes from first-hand experience of building and maintaining REST APIs in large-scale scenarios. I also believe that REST APIs in their purest form haven't been as popular with developers as they should be, and that's something I'm hoping that I can fix with this course. Now let's spend a moment to talk a bit about the course structure, what you can expect from the course, and how to get the most out of it. And I'm also going to give you a small teaser of the application that we're going to build as part of this course. Inside of the Pragmatic REST APIs course, there are 9 core chapters, and you will find some bonus content at the end. Each chapter could include anywhere from 6 to even 18 lessons inside, and sometimes these lessons are going to be pretty long. I definitely wasn't in a hurry explaining these concepts in depth, so I hope that you aren't in a hurry as well, and I recommend that you take your time and watch these lessons carefully because that's how you'll get the most out of it. At the beginning of each lesson, I'll give you a few pointers. First, I'm going to cover what is going to be our topic for this lesson, and I'm going to give you a simple agenda of what we will cover in this lesson and what our goal is. If there are any additional resources that will be helpful to you and I couldn't include them in the video, I will let you know, and you'll typically be able to find them under the video either as embedded content or links to external resources. Inside of this course, we'll be building an application from scratch. I'm literally going to start from an empty Visual Studio solution, and we're going to take this all the way into production. So it will not be feasible to always write all of the source code for a given lesson from scratch, and sometimes I may introduce some code behind the scenes, in which case I will let you know that you can download the latest version of the source code and it's going to be available under the respective video. Now let me give you a small teaser of what we are going to build inside of Pragmatic REST APIs. This is what the documentation for our REST API is going to look like. What you are seeing here is the Scalar user interface, which is rendering our OpenAPI specification. We're going to be building a developer habit tracking application. It's going to have many interesting features, and it's also going to have an integration with the GitHub REST API. I already mentioned the client application, and here's what that's going to look like. It's nothing too sophisticated, but it's enough to demonstrate how to integrate with a hypermedia-driven REST API. I also promised that we are going to build a fully automated deployment pipeline to Azure, and this is what the individual steps are going to look like. We're going to build and test our application, where the testing is going to include both integration testing and functional testing using a real database. Then we're going to apply our database migrations using EF Core bundles before deploying our REST API into Azure. And I think we can slowly wrap up this introductory lesson to Pragmatic REST APIs. In the next lesson, I'm going to share some tips and tricks of how you should use this course to get the most value out of it. Welcome to the next lesson in the Pragmatic REST APIs course, where I want to give you a couple of pointers of how you should use this course to maximize the knowledge that you take away. There are two ways of how you could watch this course. You could watch this course from beginning to end, or you could choose to watch the parts that are the most relevant to what you're currently working on. My recommendation is to always watch this course from beginning to end, because if you skip some parts, you might lose important concepts and you won't be able to understand why some decisions were made. Now, of course, I understand that your time is valuable, so I leave it up to you to decide how you're going to consume this course. Let's talk about some prerequisites and what you're going to need if you want to code along with me inside of this course. I will be using Visual Studio for most of the coding, but you could also use VS Code or Writer, I don't judge. We will be using VS Code for the client application. When it comes to the .NET version, I'll be using the latest one, which is .NET 9, but you can also use .NET 8 if you want to. You'll see very quickly that the specific .NET version doesn't really matter, because I'm going to set up the project in such a way that we can easily upgrade or downgrade .NET versions. When .NET 10 or any newer .NET version comes out, I'll include a bonus chapter at the end of the course demonstrating how to upgrade. You're also going to need some ASP.NET Core experience, mainly with controllers, because that's what I will be using for building our REST API. I won't be covering the basics of ASP.NET Core, as I already expect you to have some knowledge around this. However, I'll do my best to explain every line of code that I write. You're also going to need Docker or Docker Desktop for containerizing our application and running any external services, but you could also use any alternative that allows you to run containers. If you want to run the client application, you're going to need Node.js, and you're going to need some API testing tool. My recommendation is Postman. It's feature-rich, it's well-known, it's well-documented, and I can easily share my Postman collection with you, but if you are using some other API testing tool, that is perfectly acceptable. And I want to give you a few quick technical tips that are going to make following this course easier. First, I recommend that you download the Postman collection or the OpenAPI specification, and that's what I'm going to be using for testing our REST API. By downloading the entire Postman collection or the OpenAPI specification, you can save on some time when setting up your API testing tool. Second, I recommend that you always use the latest version of the source code if you want to be coding alongside me with the videos, and I expect that many of you will. I will be introducing some changes behind the scenes in some lessons, and if you aren't using the most up-to-date version of the source code, you will quickly find yourself in a situation where you can't keep adding new code. Lastly, it's important to understand that the video lessons inside of this course aren't the only valuable thing that you get. I'm also going to include many useful resources and learning material that's going to be available typically below the videos, and that's why it's so easy to skip. So be on the lookout for that as we go through the lessons. And now you are ready for our next chapter, where I'm going to introduce you to REST APIs, what they are and how to build them, and we'll cover many more topics. So I'll see you in the next lesson.